Well, good morning, afternoon, evening, nighttime, whatever time it is where you're watching. Thanks for joining us. I'm Eric Meyer, one of the co-founders of NFET Apart, and with me are Rachel Andrew and Jeremy Keith. Thank you both for joining us.
Hi.
Pleasure to be here.
Hello. You're both coming from the UK. I'm coming from the US, but it's sunny where all of us are, so that we were just admiring the beautiful weather. It's like completely clear here, which is unusual for March. But anyway, we're not here to talk about weather. This is not a meteorology conference. It's a web design and UX conference. And so, um, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was your book, HTML5 for Web Designers, which the two of you have co-authored. How did that come about?
Well, the original edition of the book was just me.
Hmm.
And it was the very first of the book of parts. So it was
Yeah.
all one big experiment. Like, I remember, I think Jeffrey originally said, hey, let's co-author a book on HTML5. And I was like, yes, except for the co-author bit. I'm not sure about that. I've never done that. So how about I just write it? And it all went great. That was 2010, I think, that book came out.
Hmm. Wow.
And it was a couple of years later. It was a great success, which was very gratifying. I think it was very much a case of right place, right time. It landed at just the perfect moment.
Hmm.
And Jeffrey and the Book Apart team got in touch again to talk about a second edition. And I'd never done a second edition, and frankly, I wasn't that keen on revisiting something. It felt like you can never step in the same river twice or something. So I was like,
Hmm.
I don't really want to. I don't want to do that. But I was also nervous about the prospect of somebody else um, taking the book and making a second edition of it. But then they said, "What about Rachel?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, that will work. Do that. Get Rachel to do it."
There you
To
go.
add to her pile of books she's written. I don't know what the exact number is, but it's just one
I
more on that.
don't actually know at this point, so it's quite a few.
Uh, do you have a rough estimate?
Somewhere about 23, 24, something like that I've authored or co-authored. I mean, there was quite a lot of early books that I wrote the sort of web standardsy stuff for, like
Mm.
Dreamweaver books, where someone else was doing the back end. When Dreamweaver brought out Ultra Dev and it had all the back end functionality as well, there was a whole raft of books came out um, that covered kind of everything. And so they had
Yeah.
sort of two or three authors working on them.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Very cool. 23 or so. 20.
Something like
We'll call
that.
it 25. Let's round up to a quarter century of
quite
books.
quite a few. Yeah.
That is quite a few. That's I can only think of one other author who even comes close. So that's more than most almost any other author I can think of. Put any two of them together, and they still don't
There
reach
are a
the total.
few, and there are several women with a lot of
That's true.
web design development books.
Yeah.
But I was doing a bit of research into this recently, and the prolific authors do seem to be exclusively women writing about, and people who started sort of way back when, which is
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. The person I was thinking of was Molly Holschlag, who
Yeah.
wrote a bazillion books, but also again a woman and also someone who started early. So what was it like updating the book?
Um, it's always interesting taking on. I mean, I've done, and also, as an editor, I often do quite substantial
Mm.
bits of rewriting and sort of developmental editing on people's work. So, but it's sort of always interesting taking on, because obviously Jeremy's got a very distinct voice, and
Mm.
the book was written in his voice. It hadn't been kind of taken away from that. And sometimes you get edited to the point that you can't really tell who's written something, and that wasn't the
Yeah.
case. And it's not the case with the Book Apart books. They let people sort of work in their own voice, and so it was a balance of keeping that, but also because I was being listed as a co-author, I wasn't ghostwriting it. Also
Mm.
bringing in a bit of myself and my own thoughts and things. So that was an interesting balance to take. Um,
Yeah.
but I think because I think we're fairly well aligned, Joe and myself, on the way we think about things. We both came into the industry at a similar time. We've both been
Mm.
very involved with things like the web standards movement and so on. So that kind of made it easier, because I could kind of think, well, it wasn't likely I was going to really disagree with a lot that Jeremy was saying. So that made it easier. It would be much harder, I think, to co-author something where there were fundamental differences, and I don't think that was the case. and obviously we're both Brits, and there's a bunch of stuff that they sort of came, sort of from it kind of worked quite well. So yeah.
It's funny you mentioned the tone of voice thing, because I remember when Jeffrey was talking about putting this heist together, the book apart thing. Himself and Jason and Mandy were saying like, yeah, and we want it to be in your own voice. And I heard them, but I was a little skeptical. It's like, yeah, you say that now. Wait until you actually read something in my voice, right? So I kind of submitted the first chapter literally in my voice, like I would write on my blog, maybe even cranked up a bit more, and then waited for them to come back and say, okay, maybe, not that. But actually they came back and said, yep, this is great. Looking forward to the next chapter. And I was like, oh, wow, they actually do let you write in your own voice. Okay, great stuff.
Right. Yeah, it's a difficult balance to get. I mean, because you want people to come across as them, but you also want it to be understandable to people all over the world. And I think, you sort of, it can be quite difficult to keep that and not include stuff that's just going to be confusing to people.
Yeah, there's a Korean edition of HTML5 for web designers, and it's got a lot more footnotes for explaining cultural references.
I mean, I've had some works translated. I can't think of them having an extra number of footnotes. They're usually just straight up translations, and they figure anything that gets lost in translation is lost in translation. So that's actually really impressive.
No, they really went for it. I don't know what they're saying, but it's like Korean characters, Twisted Sister, Korean characters. Like.
Amazing.
That must have been a "we're not going to take it."
That was the heading. That was the heading. We're not going to take it.
And then it's footnoted, and there's a whole thing about the band Twisted Sister had a. That's real. I mean, I didn't know this because I will admit I've never read the Korean edition of HTML5 for web designers, or even seen it. That's quite impressive for a publisher. I had no idea about that. That's awesome. That's Korean Twisted Sister Korean. I'm just picturing that. It's awesome. Sorry, you've completely sidetracked me with Twisted Sister. As a child of the 70s and 80s, that's a thing that can happen. But yeah, and if anyone wants to see the how this worked out in English, we actually are doing a March special at an event apart. Anyone who purchases a 3-day pass during this month gets a free ebook copy of HTML5 for Web Designers by Rachel and Jeremy. I don't believe that covers the Korean edition, but I guess if people want to ask for a special ebook, we'll see what we can do. Yeah, so how many languages has it been translated into now?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I don't know. So French for sure.
Okay.
I know there's a French, the Korean. That might be it, It might just be those two.
Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting with translations because every now and again I'll get an email from someone in a language I do not understand, and it's because they've got a version of my book in their language and so assume that I understand that language, and I'm like, as I'm like going through Google Translate with it, trying to work out the gist of what's been said, and so it's quite it's quite interesting that sort of these things get sort of translated all over the place, and then folk sort of like they want to reach out to the author, but
they
don't speak the same language,
Yeah. Well, I mean, at least we do have Google Translate. So the second edition that was written 2016 or so. Is that correct?
I can't remember.
It's probably about then. I don't know. Everything. Time has got very, very strange, hasn't it? But.
Sure. So, can you think of anything that you would want to include now if you were to do a third edition? No, and just to be clear to everyone, I'm not like subtly announcing a third edition. I have nothing to announce. I'm just wondering if you were to update it for today, let's say second edition 0.1. Is there anything that you think you might add?
I mean, the most of the book was taken up with here are the new things in HTML, that are no longer new. They've been there now for years, which is great.
Right.
I'm not sure if I even mentioned what, in hindsight, might have been the biggest thing about HTML5, which was the error handling, the specifying, here's how browsers should handle errors in HTML. Because that's not something that developers need to know. It's something that browsers need to know.
Right.
But in hindsight, it's probably the most important thing that happened. more than any particular elements we got. So maybe, be worth throwing it in for historical interest. There's kind of what web browsers were like before HTML5, and there's what web browsers were like afterwards. And maybe it's linked to like the rate of change in browsers also increased in the 2010s compared to the 2000s.
Yeah.
They perhaps had to spend less time reverse engineering the competition to see how they handle errors and could just use the spec. But again, it's not. Is that of interest to developers? Because it's not something that directs them, affects them directly. So I don't know. I'd want to include maybe a note about it.
What do you think, Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, I guess because there's a bunch of stuff about the sort of the conflict really between the sort of living standards and the W3C, which has kind of come to a resolution now, in terms of how those specs go forward. So that's a thing, because there was quite a lot of that stuff, because it was quite, I think in the first edition it was all quite contentious still, and it was sort of resolving by the time we did the second edition, and that's kind of, so that's sort of, I think, useful for people to know, because it is useful to know what the sort of canonical place to look for things is and how these things update. I'm always trying to persuade people to look at specifications and that they're not as terrifying as as people might think. So there's that. But I mean, the nice thing about writing an HTML book is that it doesn't particularly change. And I think as well, there's still a lot of need for education around what might seem relatively basic HTML, just understanding how the different elements should be used. And I know when I've sort of published articles in various places that have covered HTML, they've been incredibly popular, because I think there's a lot of folk just searching for, what should I be using? Should I be, do I use the main element? Do I use article? What, where am I supposed to put my headings? All that sort of stuff. And I think that it's a book that does sort of stand the test of time a bit, because of that. Things don't change so much with markup languages.
Right. So is anything, are there any changes coming up to the markup language?
In HTML, you mean?
Yeah.
I don't know. It feels an awful lot like the mid 2000s. It feels pretty stagnant to me. So there's the whole idea of the extensible web manifesto, where it's like, okay, instead of creating new HTML or even new CSS, we're going to put all the tools in the hands of developers and let them do it. Which I kind of get, with the idea being that over time, then the successful stuff gets minted into HTML or CSS. So with CSS, it's Houdini. With HTML, it's web components. And it seems like that's where a lot of effort has gone. And rather than create a new element, it would be more like, okay, let's create the underlying tools to allow people to create new elements. But it feels like, we've been promised this for quite a while, and it's still just around the corner. Yeah. And meanwhile, people keep creating interface elements out of divs and JavaScript, where it'd be awfully nice if there were an HTML element for some of the commonly used controls that people have on web pages.
Right.
Yeah. I think both for HTML and CSS, the whole issue of sort of controls and interface elements, form stuff, and it is a bit of a mess, really. It's difficult for people to understand, and browser support for a lot of things, things like the various different sort of widgets for interfacing with forms and things. Browser support for them is not great, and it's varied, and they all look different. So I think that there's probably space there to look more at those things.
Yeah, and there is a work going on there, which is great. I mean, Nicole and Greg are doing all this work around that, which
Nicole and Greg.
In some ways, it's like what I was saying earlier about HTML5, and the important bit being the standardizing on error handling. Like if we could standardize on here's how browsers style form controls, so here's how you can also override those styles and style the bits inside the form controls. Right. That would be great.
So you mentioned Nicole and Greg, but Nicole and Greg are who?
Oh, I'm sorry, Nicole Sullivan, Greg Whitworth. Who else is working on this? There's a bunch of people from Microsoft, Google, and Apple, I think. Looking at, I mean, first of all, looking at making the browser native styles for form controls nicer. But I think the next step is how do we give developers access to get in there and style those things.
I mean, considering the browsers haven't really had access in there for a long time. I mean, form controls have always been
well, in theory, right? What's it, replace content
box of no touchiness.
Yeah, well, they are. I mean, they are. They are a bit of a black box.
I'm saying,
yes, yeah, they are a bit of a black box. Because and they are, and they're different. They're different. They are like fundamentally different in different engines. Is part of the problem.
Right.
So I think, yeah, and yeah, I mean, it's very much an accessibility issue, and changing those things because people are accustomed to how they work and devices know how they work, even if the way they work is really weird. It's kind of they've been really weird for a long time, so it's sort of things already know how they work. So I think that's it. It's a hard place to touch. It's really great that there is work happening on that.
I mean, it's been an unresolved area for a really long time.
And it always comes up if you ask developers. If you say, what's a problem to you, they'll say form elements.
Forms. Because it's just, I mean, one of my favorite examples is what happens if I apply padding to a select. Like, what does that do to the options and blah blah blah, right? And we're not going to resolve that here, but that's Nicole Sullivan, Greg Wentworth, and the other people in that group are working to resolve those kinds of questions. Like, how do we deal with that sort of thing so that not only do browsers know what to do, but also developers can do things, which historically we haven't been able to.
I mean, it's really doing what has already been done with the rest of CSS or what have you, in that there is a proper spec for everything, and so browsers do the same thing, and that makes our lives easier. They're kind of because of the complexity of the things, they've kind of been left out of that a bit. It'd be interesting to see where it goes.
That's been an interesting shift over the last few years and I think we could probably credit HTML5 for this, where specifications, particularly CSS, was famous for saying, this property does this. The details are undefined. We'll let you figure it out, basically, is what they were saying to browsers. And now specs are much more, okay, here is the exact algorithm to determine, like for grid layout, there's a whole long section on the exact algorithm for figuring the layout. And I think we can credit that to HTML5, and it's what Jeremy was talking about, the very detailed error handling, and other such things, basically saying, no, we're defining this.
Right? Yeah, I mean, I think as well, CSS has got so much more complicated. There's so much more stuff that it couldn't be. I mean, there were a lot of specs. I mean, I took on multicol, which kind of got abandoned for a long time. And when I took it on, it was really just a list of examples. There was example after example with no spec text to actually explain what was going on. It was just sort of saying, here's how it should look. And there was, it wasn't actually saying exactly how that should happen. And I think that was quite common. I think that was there were lots of specs there was lots and lots of examples, and you could look at it and go, oh, yes, that seems roughly sensible. But it's like things. I remember we defined how big the gap should be. It just happened that all the browsers had defaulted that to 1M. But it wasn't in the spec. It just happened that that's what they'd done, So it was stuff like that, actually just tying down all the little bits. And I think that's been a common story with older specs and older parts of CSS. And the newer things like grid have been much more tightly defined.
Well, can I throw a provocation in here then?
Oh,
if what we've seen over time is, to begin with, they're specs, but they're relatively loose, and it's up to each browser how they want to do the details. And then we was okay, that needs to change. So over time, the specs get really detailed, and we get things like here's how you do error handling in HTML. Here's how multi-call works. Much more tightly controlled. So all the different browsers will do it the same. Isn't the next step that there's just one browser engine? What's the problem? I'm being a devil's advocate here.
Well,
it does feel like the next logical step.
I don't know if it is the next logical step. I think in some ways, specs are made better by there being more than one implementation of these things, because it might be very straightforward for one engine to do something. And sometimes that's the case. You'd be talking about something and someone will say, yeah, we can do that. Or they have already done it as a demo. They said, look, we can just do this. And here it is. Firefox have done a bunch of stuff with Grid, with things like masonry layout. And they were able to do that and show it. But the fact that then other engines have to look at that and say, well, can we do it? And hopefully try to do it and report back and say, actually, this is going to be a problem. And enough time, even just at meetings, people will just look and say, oh, that's going to be really difficult to do, or we're not going to be able to do that until this other thing is ready. And I think that makes the specs better, because it's not just about some quirk in one rendering engine that allows things to happen. It's saying, well, if we do this, two engines can do it, and therefore if something else comes along in the future, they should also be able to do it. They're not going to have to build part of their engine to be like Firefox or like Chromium just in order to do this thing. It should kind of work. And I think that that makes things better. It makes things more thought through. It means that you don't just have someone's kind of brainchild being implemented because they know how that works in their system. And I think that helps. It means we have to have discussion, but it's not just browsers. There's other things as well, and there's all the print user agents and so on feeding into this. Can they implement Grid? And so I think that that there are other things as well as browsers. And if we did get to a point where there really was only one engine, I think there are other things as well that can be feeding into that.
Yeah. I don't think I could say any better than that, so I'm not going to. And I think it's getting on towards supper time, so at least for the two of you. So anything else? Like to tell people where they can find you online?
Sorry.
Okay, I'm
Rachel.
at Rachel Andrew pretty much everywhere, so Twitter and other places, so you can find me there.
Yep.
And I'm adactio.com is my website, my online home. And if I am on other services, I'm usually Adactio there as well. But my website is very much the canonical address for me.
Yes. Done a lot of indie web stuff with the website. All right. Well, and I'm Meyer Web most places. You'll see Jeremy and Rachel at Spring Summit. You'll also see me not speaking, but doing some emceeing duty during Spring Summit in April. That's about a month from now, as a matter of fact. I think about it. And as I said before, if you register for a 3-day ticket during this month, you get a free copy of HTML5 for Web Designers by Rachel and Jeremy. So thank you both so much for joining me. It was really great to talk to you. We don't get to do it enough these days, but hopefully, we'll see each other again next month at a minimum. So thanks all.
Looking forward to it.
Thanks everyone for joining us.
Bye.